I'm sad. And do you want to know why? We live in a timeline where we got Square Enix's Avengers game, Gotham Knights, and Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, but we didn't get the sick Daredevil game or the Flash game. There has truly never been a greater tragedy. Superhero games have been around for as long as video games have been a thing, and they just make sense. A lot of superheroes lend themselves terrifically to the power fantasy that video games can offer, and recently we have seen a surge in interest in bringing more superheroes to the medium, thanks to stellar titles like the Batman Arkham series, the Insomniac Spider-Man games, and even some of the underrated ones like the Guardians of the Galaxy game or infamous Second Son. There are so many superhero games on the horizon. Some sound amazing, and some are Suicide Squad. But what about those superhero games that never got made? There is a treasure trove out there of cancelled superhero games, perfect for when you just want to wistfully look out the window and wonder what could have been. So today, I'll be looking at some of the cancelled superhero games that personally interest me and talk about what they could have been and why they were cancelled. So let's not waste any time and look at some cancelled superhero games. Batman is probably the hero recently with the most consistent presence in video games. On almost every generation, there has been a handful of Batman games to play, and one of the most consistent ways to get a new Batman game is when a new Batman movie was coming out. And this is how we didn't get the planned game based on The Dark Knight. This game would have been developed by Pandemic Studios Brisbane, and initially started life as a linear game, similar to that of the Batman Begins game on the previous generation. However, they wanted this to be the first open world Batman game, which would have allowed players to explore Gotham on foot, in the air, and in the vehicles used in the movies. There were also plans to expand the story beyond the movie and have villains such as the Electrocutioner, Deadshot and Black Mask show up in the game too. This game sounded super promising. Even at one point during early development, Bono of U2 went to the offices of the devs and was very impressed with the game. Let's just hope he doesn't write a musical based off Batman. This sounds like it could have been very ambitious, and if well done, could have been great. So what went wrong? But the biggest problem with development was the engine that they were using. In the Los Angeles branch of Pandemic, they were making a new engine custom built for detail-rich open-world games. This engine was dubbed Odin, and was seen as exactly what the project needed to get off the ground. So, once the engine was ready, they put all their assets into it, ready to see the power of Odin, and it barely worked. Odin's capabilities were very over-exaggerated. Even just putting Batman's model in the build and trying to move him around caused the frame rate to drop down to 5 frames a second. And God help you if you tried to add any more NPCs, because it would cause the game to freeze and then crash. What also didn't help was that the lighting system used in the game was so advanced it had to be retooled manually every time they changed the environment slightly. All these technical problems spelled doom for the project. So they delayed it from its initial July release and pushed it to December to have it coincide with the home release of the film. They did their best to try and get the game working before then, but with a tight deadline and technical problems, it just wouldn't be possible. They couldn't delay the game past the December date either because EA would lose the license to Batman shortly after December. So if they wanted to get the game out, it had to be then. I mean, at least if it didn't come out, it would be fine because they hadn't officially announced the game, so at least fans wouldn't be too disappointed. Until Gary Oldman let slip in a G4 interview about the game and made things a whole lot worse. With all these problems, it was no shock that the game was cancelled, and at the time, this made it the only Batman movie not to have a tie-in game to release alongside it. The game not being released apparently lost EA over $100 million in revenue, and shortly after, Pandemic Studios would shut down. Now, would this game actually be any good? It could have been. While the game sounds insanely promising, putting aside the technical problems, looking at other licensed games at the time, I doubt this would have been something genuinely terrific. I think it's still sad that this game's cancellation led to the studio being shut down, but while we're on the topic of Batman, let's look at another cancelled Batman game, which would have been an adaptation of Gotham by Gaslight. Day One Studios in 2009 pitched a Gotham by Gaslight game, which would have followed the plot of the original comic and would have seen Batman in a 19th century Victorian-inspired Gotham trying to hunt down Jack the Ripper. The game didn't get too far into development, only early concepts were ever really done and a mock-up build which showed Batman running around in Gotham. The reason this game never got made was because Day One Studios pitched the game to THQ, who then went to Warner Brothers to try and get the rights to the character, and they were told no, so the project was canned. I mean, I can't say I'm too upset with it being cancelled. I haven't read Gotham by Gaslight, but I think now, this idea could be something to revisit. I mean, we've had plenty of games with a more classic take on Batman, thanks to the Arkham series, so if they were ever to revisit this concept, I think it could work. But while we're on the topic of the Arkham games, let's look at the last Batman game I wanted to look at today, the cancelled sequel to Arkham Knight. This game, only known as Project Sabbath, would have followed Damian Wayne trying to take on the role of Batman in a Batman Beyond-esque scenario. This game wouldn't have been made by Rocksteady, but rather would have been developed by Warner Bros. Montreal, the team behind Arkham Origins and Gotham Knights. The game was cancelled for unknown reasons, but the idea of following Gotham after Bruce Wayne's death would have been reworked into Gotham Knights, which, let's be honest, it's essentially an Arkham sequel. Like, they could have put it in continuity with the Arkham games and it would be fine. But that's enough about Batman. So let's move on to DC's next big superhero and talk about the cancelled Superman game, Superman Blue Steel. Superman Blue Steel entered development in 2007 for the PS3, Xbox 360 and Wii at Factor 5. This game started life as a tie-in to the film Superman Man of Steel, the sequel to Superman Returns, which also got cancelled and isn't to be confused with the Zack Snyder movie of the same name. Publishing duties would have been handled by Brash Entertainment, a relatively new publisher who had the noble goal of creating high-quality tie-in games, restoring faith in them, and these were the only games they published. This game would have seen Superman going up against several villains from his rogues gallery, such as Lex Luthor, Darkseid, Brainiac, Zod, and Doomsday. The game would have let players take full control of Superman in an open-world metropolis, would have had a dynamic destruction system where you could fly enemies through buildings in a very spectacular fashion. God, maybe this game does have more in common with Zack Snyder's Man of Steel than I thought. For the most part, the game was focused on two things: making Superman feel great to control, and allowing players to duke it out with Superman's biggest villains in a way that had never been done before. There were also plans for a multiplayer mode featuring the likes of Supergirl. Altogether, this sounds like it could have been incredibly good, and honestly, could have worked on its own without the movie. So, why was it cancelled? Well, the first reason was because the movie it was supposed to tie into was cancelled by Warner Bros. And that was probably for the best considering who the director was. This actually didn't spell the end for the game initially, as they started to rework the game into its own standalone thing. But Warner Bros., being the geniuses that they are, became less interested in the game and offered very little support to either Factor 5 or Brash Entertainment. The game was coming along well, but it was still very much in the concept phase of development. Then in November of 2008, Brash filed for bankruptcy and shut down, leaving Factor 5 without a publisher for the game. Factor 5 would shop the game around to various publishers, however, no one wanted to fund it because of the ongoing financial crisis at the time. This all proved to not only be too late for the project, but Factor 5 as well. Factor 5 would shut down in December and the game would never be finished. I think out of all the games we've covered so far, and I know we've only covered 4, but shut up, this one hurts the most. Superman hasn't had a great reputation when it comes to video games. Like, we can't just not talk about Superman 64. Well, while we're on the topic of Superman 64, there was a PS1 port planned for that would have tried to fix the game, but that was also cancelled. But we're not going to talk about that any further because I don't care. But a lot of people seem to think that Superman just doesn't work in the medium of video games. This game, if it was finished, could have proved those people wrong. Superman can be done well in video games, he just needs to be done right. Another sad thing about this story is that the developers were lied to by the higher-ups and didn't get paid for the last 2 months of work on the game. This resulted in several lawsuits from them trying to get compensated for their work, which is horrible they had to do that. You know, with all these lawsuits, I think someone's gonna have to hire a lawyer, and a good one at that. A Daredevil game was in development in the early 2000s, developed by 5000 Feet, titled Daredevil, The Man Without Fear. The game would have been an open world game which would have let you explore Hell's Kitchen. You could use Daredevil's abilities in ways that almost sound like a precursor to what would have become Detective Vision in the Arkham games. The game would have let players traverse through Hell's Kitchen using billy gloves to grapple around, as well as rail grinding. You know, the thing Daredevil's known to do. The story would have been an original story following the assassination of Wilson Fisk, a gang war would break out in New York that Daredevil would have to quell. It would have seen cameos from the likes of the Punisher and Black Widow, and Elektra would have played a predominant role in the story. The game initially was going to use the Renderware engine, but the publisher Encore was a cheap bitch and didn't want to pay for the engine, so they decided to make their own. This is the second game we've looked at in the last 10 minutes where the engine would be a big problem. So, what else went wrong in the development of this game? Well, weirdly enough, Sony proved to be a huge issue. While they weren't directly involved with this game's development, the committee at Sony that oversees third-party releases took an interest in this game and started giving the devs ideas that clashed heavily with what Marvel wanted. Remember that rail grinding thing I mentioned? Yeah, that was Sony's fault. They thought it could have been fun and capitalized on the trend of the Tony Hawk games at the time. Ah, yes. The natural place to look for inspiration when working on a Daredevil game. Marvel wanted the game to be closer to the actual comics, and when trying to appease both sides, the developers ended up pleasing neither, and eventually, Marvel pulled the rights for the property, causing the game to be cancelled. But that wasn't the only problem with this game. Remember that custom-built engine they were making? Yeah, it didn't work. The engine was severely underpowered. This caused the dev team to have to scale back the game's scope, making the open world smaller and lessening the importance of mechanics such as Daredevil's abilities. On top of the conflict with outside sources, there was also a lot of turmoil within the team itself, with many of the project leads trying to pull the game in multiple directions. So even if Marvel didn't pull the rights for this game, it probably would have been likely that this game never would have released anyway because of these issues. It's a damn shame too, because this game sounds like it could have truly been something great. All of the ideas for the game, and to be honest, I'm even including the rail grinding here, could have added up to make something great. Unfortunately, we'll never get this game. Since this game's cancellation, we've yet to see another developer take a crack at making a proper Daredevil game. I guess we'll just have to settle for Daredevil in Fortnite for now. And while we're on the topic of cancelled Marvel games, let's take a look at another one, and one I see barely anyone talking about: Marvel Chaos. Or Marvel Destruction. I don't know, like, all my research, there's like 2 different names for this thing, but for the rest of the video, I'm just gonna call it Marvel Chaos, okay? Anyway, Marvel Chaos was a planned 3D arena fighting game for the 360 in 2007, and would have been developed and published by EA. Oh, for fuck's sake, they're back already? The game would have had several characters from across the Marvel universe duking it out in fully destructible environments, in both multiplayer and a single player campaign. The game would have had characters such as Spider-Man, Captain America, Doctor Doom, and the Hulk, as well as many other characters from every side of the Marvel universe. There were also concepts for the single player campaign to let the players make their own character for the story. There was a system planned where during fights, if the player caused too much destruction without saving people, the public would turn on you and the police would try and shoot you. However, this was scrapped early in development due to technical issues. Unlike a lot of the games I've spoken about, this game was actually announced and shown off at Comic-Con in 2007, with this breathtaking cinematic trailer that ended with this absolutely gorgeous shot of the Hulk. I'm not one for arena fighters in all honesty, so I doubt I would have enjoyed this game if it actually was finished. But it could have been interesting to see, so why was it cancelled? Well, this time it's not to do with any major development issues, but for kind of a pathetic reason. EA shut down the Chicago branch who were working on this game in an attempt to save costs. That's it. No big drama between Marvel or the dev team, no real development issues, just EA being EA and shutting down the studio working on it. There were other factors in why this game was cancelled. For one, there were times that it was going over budget and falling behind deadlines, and also Marvel weren't happy with the quality of the game. In fact, early concept designs for the characters were apparently so ugly, Marvel told them to redo them completely. According to this story, Hulk looked like a massive fat green guy, and Spider-Man looked borderline anorexic. While I think the concept of this game sounds cool, it seems like this game wasn't shaping out to be the best, even if it was finished. I think we are far overdue for a Marvel-centered fighting game that isn't Marvel vs. Capcom or a shitty mobile game. The concept of this game sells itself and is one I hope we can see in the future be revisited by another developer. We are really in short supply of a Marvel fighting game, and it would be nice to have one. But if there's one thing that we aren't in short supply for, that's Spider-Man games. So let's talk about the cancelled Spider-Man game, Spider-Man Classic. Spider-Man Classic would have been developed by Shaba Games, the dev team behind Spider-Man Web of Shadows, and would have been focused on delivering very faithful adaptations of iconic fights across Spider-Man's long lineage from the comics. The game would have been linear as opposed to Web of Shadows open world, and would have also had Wolverine as a playable character. The game didn't get too far into development, as Shabba Games shut down in 2009, and Nooks were given the task of making Spider-Man games from that point on. And they actually reused some of the concepts from this game into their first Spider-Man game, Shattered Dimensions, which reused the Mysterio design from this game's concept art. But this isn't the last Spider-Man game to be cancelled at Activision's time with the property. Remember Spider-Man 4? No? Yeah, well that's because it never came out, and neither did the game based on it. Even after the infamous Spider-Man 3 game, Activision still decided to make a game for the fourth movie, which entered development around 2009. The game wouldn't have been made by Treyarch. Fucking hell, that's a thought. Remember when Treyarch made stuff outside of Call of Duty? Actually, let me rephrase that. Remember when any studio at Activision made stuff outside of Call of Duty? But this instead would have been developed by Radical Entertainment, the devs behind Prototype. The game was built on top of that one, featuring the New York from that game in early development footage. The plot of the game would have loosely followed the movie's plot, with Vulture as the main villain, but outside of that, we essentially know next to nothing about the story. The game had two versions in development, one for the 360 and PS3, and one for the Wii. The Wii version would have been developed by Eurocom, and from early builds we can see it would have been linear rather than the HD version's open world. This version would obviously as well have combat that would be better suited for the Wii's motion controls. As far as we can tell, neither version of the game would get too far into development because in 2010, the game was cancelled following the cancellation of the movie. Out of all the games we've looked at so far, this is probably the one I could care least about being cancelled. Is it a shame that all the devs' hard work never got to see the light of day? Yeah, obviously it is. But the fact of the matter remains, it's not like we didn't get another Spider-Man game after this. And with the current Insomniac games being, in my opinion, almost perfect Spider-Man games, minus maybe some narrative problems, it's not like we desperately need to see what this could have been. Anyway, let's move on to the last cancelled Marvel game in this video, and another movie tie-in game, but this time for a movie that actually came out, THQ's Avengers game. An Avengers game by THQ's Australian studio entered development in 2010 for the Xbox 360, PS3 and the Wii U, and was meant to coincide with the release of the movie in 2012. But it wasn't an adaptation of that film. It would have instead been an original story based off of the Secret Invasion storyline in the comics, and would have followed the Avengers fighting a Skrull invasion. The story would have been penned by Brian Michael Bendis, the original writer of the storyline, who is probably most well known for his work on titles such as Ultimate Spider-Man, Daredevil, and most recently Superman. The game would have had Iron Man, Thor, Hulk, and Captain America as playable characters, with others such as Hawkeye, Black Widow, Miss Marvel, and the Fantastic Four planned to be unlockables. The designs of the characters would have been a mix of the Ultimate Universe designs and the current MCU designs. The game would have been 4-player co-op and focused on mission-based tasks, such as defending a certain area of the map and disabling certain machines, with each character having their own unique abilities, as well as skill trees for different abilities to unlock. Hey, wait a second, that kinda sounds like... Oh shit, it's loose! Okay, no, that's unfair to this game because it would have been vastly different from that garbage. For starters, you may have noticed from the footage on screen, but the game would have been first person, rather than like everything else we've looked at so far, which has been third person. And would have had an actual endpoint to the game, rather than a decent campaign, followed by a 100-hour grindathon. The game was progressing fairly well in development, so what happened? Did the project not meet its deadlines? Marvel decide after the lukewarm response to the other MCU tie-in games that it wasn't worth it? Nope. It was because of the fucking U-Draw tablet. Now, you might be asking yourself, what's a U-Draw? Well, it's like a digital drawing tablet for a computer, but for video games. It had a mild amount of success on the Wii, so they decided to bring it to other platforms and pour an insane amount of money into it. And when it flopped, it lost THQ $100 fucking million, causing the cancellation of this game because they didn't have the money to fund it, and also led to the closure of the studio behind it. Out of all the reasons we've looked at for games being cancelled in this video, this has to be the stupidest one. Yes, this amazing looking and sounding Avengers game was cancelled because of a drawing tablet. This really sucks because from everything we saw of this game while in development, it showed an insane amount of potential. It could have been so good, and if it was finished, probably would have been the best out of everything we've looked at. A Left 4 Dead styled Avengers game sounds like a match made in heaven. And I think what makes it worse is that we were left with this piece of shit instead. But regardless of that depressing note, let's move on to the final game we'll be looking at today, cancelled Flash game. The Flash, the fastest man alive, entered development at Bottle Rocket in 2007 for, I'm getting sick of saying these fucking platforms, the Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii. The game would have been open world and seen players exploring between Central and Keystone City, which visually took inspiration from Mirror's Edge. The game would have been about Wally West's first year as the Flash, and there would have been villains such as Captain Boomerang, Gorilla Grodd, and Professor Zoom. You could obviously run around the two cities at high speeds, and you could also grind on rails, and if you went fast enough, you could run up buildings and get a ton of airtime. The game would have also had combat similar to the Mark of... How do you say that? Kirai? This game, this one here, and would have utilised the speed of the Flash in order to deliver a very satisfying combat feel. It would have also had mechanics similar to the Amazing Spider-Man 2 game, where the world would respond around you if you didn't respond to random events on the map, and they would expire after a certain amount of time. There were also plans for an online racing mode with multiple speedsters available to use, with even Superman being considered as a playable character. This game sounds like it could have been one of the best superhero games ever made, so why was it cancelled? Oh, you motherfucker. Yup, Brash Entertainment was the publisher behind this game, and because they went under, this game went under too. I hate that this game was cancelled. It honestly looked fantastic, and I reckon if it was made, it would have been a big success. But we'll never know. Well, that was fucking depressing. It's a shame that all these games were cancelled, even if some of them probably wouldn't have been the best. All the hard work that these devs put into these games were wasted. It's clear behind all of these projects, there was a passion to do these characters justice and really make something incredible. And what stings even more is that most of these were cancelled due to circumstances outside of the devs' control. There was also a lot more cancelled superhero games out there that I didn't even talk about in this video. Hell, while I was making this video, 2 more cancelled superhero games popped up. So, you know, if you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe and let me know if you want a part 2, I guess. It's a shame that these games will never see the light of day, but there's still hope. While these games were cancelled, we're currently living in an age where superhero video games are really coming into their own. Sure, we've had some recent failures like Marvel's Avengers, Gotham Knights, and Suicide Squad. Like, probably, again, I'm recording this before the games actually come out, I'm just taking an educated guess. But we've also had amazing games such as the Arkham series, the Insomniac Spider-Man games, and a lot more. And there's plenty more on the horizon too. And hopefully none of the upcoming games end up in a part 2 of this video.